back. Now, I haven't. A story broke this morning, I guess. And I haven't had a chance to read too far into these. But back in 2014, the Office of Special Investigator General for the Afghanistan Reconstruction, SIGAR, I guess they call it, SIGAR, started doing interviews. I think they did about 400 interviews, is it? Maybe more, of interviews of basically key players, 400 officials who were key players in the war in Afghanistan, not necessarily the initiation of it, but the ongoing war, the attempts at, to the extent that we have any, reconstruction over the course of the 18-year war that we're in. And the results were not good. They were bad. Here is this is the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Miley. And this was
a month ago.
Only a month ago. This was, November 10th, 2019. Here is the Joint Chief of the Joint Chiefs of Staff telling Martha McSally, we've only just begun.
I want to move to Afghanistan. We have been in Afghanistan more than 18 years. What would you say to someone who is 18 years old, who, male or female, may end up serving in a war that began before they were born?
Well, I think we have to go back to the original reason why we are in Afghanistan to begin with, which is 9/11. So we went there in order to make sure that Afghanistan never again would be a safe haven to terrorists that would attack the United States. That mission is not yet complete. And in order for that mission to be successful, the government of Afghanistan, the Afghan security forces are going to have to be able to sustain their own internal security to prevent terrorists from using their territory to attack other countries, especially the United States. That effort's ongoing. It's been ongoing for 18 consecutive years. I suspect it'll be ongoing into the future for several more years.
And when you say that, and that we're going to be there that long, that makes me think we'll be there that long in Iraq, in Syria, wherever the Islamic State is.
I think that it's not just the Islamic State, it's other groups, but I think that we will be there for a significant amount of time because it's in our national interest to be there.
I mean, it's not working, right? I mean, it's not, what we're basically doing is permanent occupation. And the late John McCain, this was what he was calling for back in 2008. And after he would say, how long, the question would be, how long do we need to stay in these countries? And he's going, well, we've been in Japan for 70 years now. More. And that was his response. We've been in Germany for 70 some odd years now, 80 years. That was his response. And this, these new Afghan papers, which are really, again, a compilation put together by the Inspector General of the Office for the Afghanistan Reconstruction, 400 plus interviews. And the transcripts of the interviews have been published by the Washington Post after a 3-year legal battle. This was a lessons learned project. And the irony of this is, of course, none of the lessons have been learned. This is simply a compilation of the lessons, but nobody's learned them. The war has cost at least $1 trillion. At least $1 trillion. That's the official figure, $1 trillion. There's no doubt in my mind it's more. And the way that they measure this, you're not looking at like what it means in terms of the VA, et cetera, et cetera. It killed more than 2,300 U.S. servicemen and women. And the thing is, none of these stories, 20,000 injured, I'm not even sure what the official count is for how many Afghanis we've killed. Tens of thousands, certainly.
Oh, that's conservative.
And that's conservative. And thousands upon thousands of innocent civilians.
Also in Pakistan. I mean, even just as a side note of things they don't account for, they're not even talking about like the environmental damage of base construction and refueling stops through Pakistan and how that disrupts, entire cities.
I mean, and not to mention things like, I mean, it's a separate thing. It's obviously bad, but it's the CIA plan to have fake NGOs, proposes fake NGOs giving people vaccinations and what that has led to. But apparently the head of SIGAR, this is the Inspector General of Afghanistan Reconstruction, this guy, John Sopko, told the newspaper that the assessments contained in the project, and again, this is not a leak, right? They got them from legal measures, but I think at that point the guy wants to make an assessment. I think, he's part of this endeavor. The project suggested that, quote, the American people have constantly, I should say, been lied to. Mm-hmm. The two major claims in the documents are that U.S. officials manipulated statistics to suggest to the American public that the war was being won, and successive administrations turned a blind eye to widespread corruption among Afghan officials, allowing the theft of U.S. aid with impunity. This is almost identical, at least broad terms, as to what the Pentagon Papers showed, which was that, no, the American public was not getting the truth as to the efficacy or the winning of the war, and also it hid the fact that even our allies didn't want us there, and they were not prepared to fight. At least I should say, to fight or to fight as we were suggesting they were fighting. They weren't on board with this project to destroy their country.
Right.
Like I say, I haven't read through these. You can go to the Washington Post and read through a vast majority, at least of highlights of these, as far as I can tell. Here's one, though, in a write-up from The Guardian. A guy named Douglas Lute, he's a lieutenant general who served as the White House Afghan war czar during the Bush and Obama administrations, told interviewers in 2015, we were devoid of a fundamental understanding of Afghanistan. We didn't know what we were doing. Remember, Obama ran in 2008 on pulling out of Iraq, but beefing up Afghanistan. He was very explicit about that. People tend to forget. I think he called for, during the campaign, up to 30,000 more troops in Afghanistan to finish the job. And apparently they were feeling very pressured to make it look like we had finished the job in Afghanistan, whatever that means. I can tell you this, that as a comedian in 2003, where my only credentials were that I had been booked to direct I'm with Busey on Comedy Central, I went on radio for the first time, got a couple hours on WFMU. And at that time, I certainly didn't know this. It must have been reported, but it was always reported on page like 17 of the paper. The first other 17 pages were all about why we should go to war. But somewhere deep in some of these papers, maybe it was McClatchy, I'm not sure, it was quite clear that we were going to spend trillions of dollars on Iraq and Afghanistan back in 2002, early 2003. And that in Afghanistan, there was no hope for us to do anything. At that time, it was the war in Afghanistan with the Soviet Union was fresh enough on people's memories where they realized, like, there's no winning there.
Oh, yeah. It's referred to sometimes as the Soviet Union's Vietnam, and our war in Afghanistan has lasted almost 10 years longer than that.
That's right.
Just to add a few snippets to it, I mean, we remember like different stories would break. I remember there was one during the Obama administration about how the Pentagon was using, I think it was called the Rendon Group, to do information management on specific journalists to massage their perception of the war. There's reports daily which get no attention of like, oh yeah, we just bombed a wedding party in Afghanistan. And related to the consistent dishonesty about this, I mean, if you read Ghost Wars and Directorate S, which are the Steve Cole like definitive histories of both sides of this from 79 through like 2016, to the extent to which there's any legitimacy to what he's talking about these omnipresent security threats, it comes through the relationship between our intelligence services and the Pakistani and the Saudi ones. And that has been like not just amplified, like it's an ongoing operative relationship, even with every type of countervailing evidence, and on both sides, like us going in and violating Pakistan's sovereignty and killing civilians, and them playing a double game with every single terrorist operation imaginable, even as there's still no deal with the Taliban. And I think it's just, you know, the war on terrorism is the framework for how we do foreign policy since Bush. And that's why these things are perpetual, like McCain wanted.
Jeffrey Egger is a retired Navy SEAL and White House staffer for Bush and Obama. You know, and some of these guys have a very sort of like, you know, consumer perspective on these things. Mm-hmm. What do we get for this $1 trillion effort? Was it worth $1 trillion? After the killing of Osama bin Laden, I said that Osama was probably laughing in his watery grave, considering how much we've spent in Afghanistan. Now, that is what bin Laden was trying to do. He knew that
That's what he said.
He knew. Within days after 9/11, or excuse me, days before 9/11, bin Laden assassinated one of the top leaders of the Northern Alliance,
Massoud,
and did so in anticipation of the possibility that we could invade, or maybe in anticipation of us relying on Massoud and those Northern Alliance forces to, you know, to do the bulk of the fighting. But it's true. Bin Laden couldn't have imagined, you know, particularly with Iraq, couldn't have imagined a better scenario. However, on top of that, on top of the fact that that Afghanistan, the prolonged involvement there, and look, there's no reason to believe that, oh, well, they only did this for Afghanistan. They wouldn't do it for Iraq. Aside from the failure on a policy level that was pursued in these instances, aside from the fact that it was ill-conceived, probably ill-executed, Bob Crowley, an Army colonel who served as senior counterinsurgency advisor to U.S. military commanders in 2013 and 2014. This is the time of that, you know, probably in the retrospect of that so-called surge, which happened, I think it was in 2011 in Afghanistan. Every data point was altered to present the best picture possible. Surveys, for instance, as you mentioned, Michael, were totally unreliable, but reinforced that everything we were doing was right, and we became a self-licking ice cream cone. And
it's like the military's best invention.
Only 62 of the people interviewed were identified. 366 other names were redacted after Saigar insisted that they be treated as whistleblowers and informants.
And then the whole other thing of the taking the idea, the whole Petraeus, that what he did in Iraq was like basically smartly cut a whole bunch of financial deals with different tribal leadership and try to sort of like slightly improve their situation.
These were Sunni
Sunnis,
in the
exactly, right.
west of the country,
right.
And they were concerned because they had all lost their jobs, because Saddam Hussein had them all on the payroll.
And that was
they
the
were
shock
a lot of
doctrinization after the
Right.
invasion.
There was a lot of former military personnel, and basically Petraeus made it look like we're going to bring in a bunch of troops, and really what they did is they brought in a bunch of suitcases of cash, and they bought them off, which frankly
That was good.
might
That
be
was-
a good
No, that
recipe
was the,
for
the prime. What I'm trying to say was like that whole thing was mythologized as a troop surge. It was the bag of cash surge that made it effective.
Fine.
And then they lied that they could basically replicate it in Afghanistan with very different dynamics.
Yep.
And frankly, the last thing, just two quick things. I mean, Obama was essentially, look, he understood that it was over. And he made a Machiavellian calculation to surge those troops. I have no doubt. He understood. I
his
mean,
trade-off
the
was
bureaucracy.
this
was
is how
against-
I'm going
yeah.
to get out of
Yeah.
Iraq.
This is how I'll get out of Iraq, and this will maybe even long term get out of Afghanistan. But he made that calculation, and he was boxed in by the military, but he knew. And Clinton was very hawkish. And then the last thing is, my God, props to Barbara Lee. The only person in the entirety of the Congress to vote against the authorization of military force weeks after the September 11th attacks. And that is
Ballsy.
unbelievably ballsy, and nothing but kudos to her.
And are we still under that AUMF?
Yes. That's the one AUMF that every couple of years
Yeah,
it's
you
Barbara Lee is still the one
Yep.
leaning to trying to change it. And I believe there's even Tim Kaine did some work in the Senate, but no, it's still the one. And it's still the one not only we're operating off of, it's still the one that a couple of months ago Pompeo said we could attack
Right.
Iran using.
Yep.
Yeah.